to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining today. My name is Jeanine Mioton and I'm the PR lead at Meetup. Today we're going to be discussing the challenges of living with disabilities. This is the sixth installment of my favorite series, the Dismantling Social Injustice series. If you've joined us for a previous event, then you would know that we've discussed mental health, urban policy, equal and civil rights for the transgender community, amongst other topics. And if you have joined us, welcome back. Glad you're back. And if this is your first time, welcome. You're in for a real treat. This is going to be a really, really great conversation. Our goal is to continue to foster these very important conversations, and which is why this is my favorite series, because it allows for us to have these conversations and to keep it going and just share, you know, the knowledge that you both have with others. So in today's discussions, Beth and LCL, this is like the funny part. His name is Lawrence, but I call him LCL. That's what his friends call him. I know that we're not there yet, but I'm a sucker for nicknames. And not for nothing, Lawrence, we've spoken so much in the past couple of weeks that I kind of consider you a friend. I mean, it may not be usual, but
I think we're there now.
Okay, all right, thanks. Okay, yeah, I was gonna say, you know, that's where I'm coming from. They're going to share the historical and systemic factors that have contributed to many of the challenges facing persons of disabilities, and the legislative and cultural actions that we can take to affect change. I'm going to quickly go over the guidelines for today's event. So this event is being recorded. However, you will not show up in the video. Only the three of us are on video. If you have to leave early or if you miss anything, don't worry. We are going to share a recording of this event on our blog, Community Matters, the Community Matters blog. This event is also muted, so if you want to say something, I'm sorry. Feel free to say it in the Q&A feature. You will only be hearing the three of us. As I mentioned, the Q&A feature, if you have any questions, we love questions, please submit them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. You may have noticed we have closed captioning. If you'd like to turn it on, click on the live screen icon, transcription icon at the bottom of your screen and select your preference. For the agenda, so in a few seconds, Beth and Lawrence are going to introduce themselves, and then we are going to dive right into our conversation with both of them, followed by Q&A. So like I said, if you have any questions, we'd love to hear from you. Please submit your questions in the Q&A feature and we will get to them at the end of the event. All right, so without further ado, so we're gonna do this a little differently. Like I usually introduce the panelists, but I cannot do your introduction, your bios justice. So I'm going to let both of you introduce yourselves. And as you know, I start with, I always start in alphabetical order. So Beth, you go first.
All right, thank you. I wish I had a cool nickname, but my name is already so short. It's just Beth. So I have no other nickname, but.
Well, Beth, wait, because I'm a sucker for nicknames, I am also the person that makes them up for everyone.
Oh, perfect.
You know, so don't worry, I got you.
Yeah, okay. By the end of this, we'll circle back. My question for the Q&A portion will be, what should my nickname
What's your
be?
nickname? Oh, I'm on the spot now. Okay, all right.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. My name is Beth. I'm originally from the Bay Area. I live in Brooklyn, New York now. I am a double amputee. I've been a prosthetic user for my entire life. And as those of us within the disabled community know, sometimes just being visible as a disabled person is a political act. So I've been very involved in activism for my entire life, all through high school and in college. After college, my first real job was becoming a campaign director for an organization called Grassroots Campaigns. There we worked on a variety of different progressive causes, doing one-on-one voter outreach, education, and fundraising. I worked for the Planned Parenthood Action Fund through them, the ACLU, the Sierra Club, and UNICEF. Then I continued doing a lot of corporate community building, and now I've been with Fiverr since 2016. I'm the Senior Diversity and Inclusion Program Manager there, so I focus a lot on finding partners, running programs, and doing external events that help close gaps to accessibility all around the world.
I love that. LCL?
Yeah, hi, I am my full name's Lawrence Carter Long, and I am the Director of Communications for the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. It's a nonprofit advocacy organization that's been around since 1979. And what we do is we specialize, we're sort of a legal nonprofit that focuses on legislation, right? Pass those laws to make sure that people aren't discriminated against. Litigation, if they are discriminated against, will sue you. And education, making sure that students who have disabilities are getting the education that they're guaranteed under laws like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We also have a media branch called the Disability Media Alliance Project, where along with my comrade, Kara Reedy, we look at and work to change media representation, both television, film, advertising, and in the news media, because the news media covers every issue. So that's really the work that we do in a nutshell, and I'm thrilled to be here with you and Beth today.
Thank you. Thank you both for joining us today. So before we dive into today's discussion, I'm just going to go over a few statistics on that impact with the impact of disability. So 1 billion people, close to 20% of the world's population has a disability. That's a lot of people. 61 million Americans have disabilities. 26% of adults have some type of disability. That's 1 in 4 adults. And 1 in 4 women have a disability. These disabilities fall into 2 buckets, invisible and visible. I'm going to leave it there because Beth and LCL are going to touch on the different types of disabilities. This is music for you, isn't it? And I just want to say that today's discussion is going to be broken up into 3 buckets. We're first going to talk about where we are today in terms of disabilities and the challenges that people face. We're going to follow it by the history, what were the contributing factors that led to where we are today? And lastly, my favorite part is what can we do to affect change in the future? So I'm going to start with Beth, alphabetical order. As I said, we're going to be discussing where we are today. So Beth, where are we today when it comes to persons with disabilities in the workplace?
Yeah, so like you touched on a little bit earlier, disabilities are both visible and invisible, right? And what that means is that there are people like myself as a prosthetic user who are visibly disabled. And then there are people who have maybe they're neurodivergent, perhaps they have chronic conditions or mental health issues that are invisible, but still have some kind of disability, right? So when we talk about representation, it's hard to know where we are because a lot of those numbers are self-reported and there's still a stigma around what it means to be disabled. So there might be people who, don't identify or want to come out and identify as having a disability, but we do know that we are still severely underrepresented in the workplace. A lot of workplaces still aren't accessible or they don't have accommodations for those with disabilities. And I know that Lawrence is going to touch on this a little bit, but I wanted to quickly talk about COVID-19 because a lot of the accommodations that we've seen as a result of COVID-19 are things that the disabled community has been advocating for a very long time, right? Things like remote work opportunities, remote learning opportunities, teledoc visits, getting prescriptions mailed to your home. So I'm hoping that a lot of these accommodations will continue to be improved upon and added to as we continue. And of course, there's been a lot of negative disproportionate effects to the disabled community from COVID-19. But these are some things that I'm hoping will really change the tide in how we see that representation moving into the future.
Thank you. Lawrence.
Yeah, I would simply say that, a lot of things that disabled people have been asking for, begging for, suing for, right? In terms of access and accommodation for decades now, because of COVID-19, maybe one of the only bright spots to come out of this is that many of those things that we were told they couldn't do, it was too expensive, it was too difficult, we didn't know how, have suddenly miraculously become commonplace. Right? We're all working from home now. We all have a certain degree of flexibility in terms of those work schedules or the manner in which we work. So hopefully what we'll be seeing going forward. I don't think that, the genie has been let out of the bottle. And so the old ways are never going to go back to sort of being the only ways. And it'll be interesting to see as we go forward, maybe into next spring and next summer, how many of these changes will keep with us and will adapt in our own workplaces and in our lives.
Agreed. Yeah, I hope that a lot of these changes do remain. Beth, what is the unemployment rate, and what are the factors involved with the unemployment rate for persons with disabilities?
Yeah, so the employment rate for disabled has hovered around 30% for the past, couple of decades, and that's the employment rate. So unemployment sits at around 70%, and we know that this metric has only worsened during COVID. So the status is not great, right? And there's a lot of reasons for this. One, again, going back to workplaces being accessible, offering accommodations, offering remote options. But two, and we'll touch on this a little bit later, there's a lot of forced unemployment that happens when you are limited in how you can collect things like disability benefits, right? So in order to be eligible to receive some disability benefits or Social Security income benefits based on disability, a current applicant or recipient who's single can't have more than $2,000 in one-time in assets. So this means that some disabled people actually have to choose to remain unemployed for access to life-saving medical treatments and resources. So there's a lot that needs to change to help get those numbers up. But at the end of the day, there is a huge stigma against hiring those with disabilities. And so, simply if you look around your workplace and you don't work with anybody who identifies as having a disability, then something needs to change, right? You need to hire us.
Yeah, I like that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on in the discussion. Lawrence, one of the initiatives that you work on is persons with disabilities in the media, right? So where are we today in terms of how they're represented?
Yeah, the news media is really important, as I sort of joked about earlier, because the news media covers everything else, right? So that would include discrimination cases involving access requirements and employment discrimination. The news media also reviews movies and reports on new businesses that opened or weather changes, right? And that would include forest fires and earthquakes and other national disasters. It could be your sports, it could be your entertainment, your TV, your radio. So media has this huge influence in helping shape and also change perceptions and misconceptions about disability. So in every news beat you can think of, there's a disability component, even if they aren't reporting on it as such. And so what the problem that we find is that the fears and the stereotypes about disability are so deeply ingrained in different cultures that those are then reflected in the news media. And then people with disabilities are just seldom seen as individuals beyond the framework of that disability. And so we have this legacy of these demeaning, kind of isolating, and of institutionalizing people with disabilities that sort of gain a tidal wave of their own. And all of a sudden, if that's the only kind of representation you see about disability, you start to think that's more real than reality, right? And I've lost count of how many young people, when I've gone to middle schools and high schools, for example, where I ask young folks, what do they want to do when they get out of school? What's next for them? And they'll tell me that they want to be an inspirational speaker, because that's the only thing they've seen a disabled person do when they haven't accomplished anything. They haven't achieved anything yet, but they think that their lot in life is to be inspirational for non-disabled people. So there was this 1991 landmark study a guy named Paul Hunt did, where he looked at the stereotypes. And this would be true in film, this would be true in TV, this would be true in advertising, it's also true in the news media. So they cross those different areas that tend to persist around the portrayal of disabled people. And I'll just go through them real quickly. See how many of these resonate with you. As I say them, think to yourself, have I seen that before? Disabled people as pitiable or pathetic, right? A tragic individual. Somebody who's a victim, right? Somebody, an object of curiosity or of violence. In turn, usually when that happens, think of the Joker. They become sinister or evil, right? And then you've got the flip side of that same coin, the super cripple. And this is where everyday things become suddenly inspirational. That just getting up, being seen in the grocery store is amazing to people, and they're blown away how you as a disabled person could do that. And that becomes a burden for disabled folks, right? Sometimes you just want to grab your six-pack and go home, but all of a sudden you're there forced to kind of represent or to address this assumption people have about you because they've seen it in the media. Laughable, the butt of jokes, a foil, somebody who's his or her own worst enemy, a burden, right? Somebody living off social welfare or public programs, somebody who's non-sexual. We could do a whole different presentation on that and how common that is. And then lastly, I think being unable to participate in daily life, that includes employment, somebody who's isolated and alone. And so, it's usually, most of those stories are about the disabled individual against the world. You never see more than one disabled person with another disabled person or a group of disabled people. You never see disability community. You'd think if there were 61 million of us in the United States or 20% of us across the world, we might be hanging out together, learning from each other, sort of like we're doing now. But that's something you very, very rarely see in media. So these stereotypes, it's important to bring it up in terms of media, persist to a large degree because we don't have enough disabled people writing, producing, or editing them. We need people that are going to be working in these industries who can give a necessary reality check before they reach the airwaves, our newspapers, magazines, or computer screens. And so far, we've got 26% of the US population representation in the media. When we can even gauge numbers, on a good day is closer to 2%. So that means we've got a lot of making up to do to be truly representational.
Thank you, Lawrence. I feel like I froze somewhere along the way, but I have to say that, yes, I've seen each story in a movie or on TV or, in a commercial or something, but yes, I've seen each story. And to me, what's really scary about that is that, people that don't know someone with a disability, right? And this is like their first, I guess, like not interaction, but like the first time they see that, right? Then this becomes like their perception.
Right. Right. And they might, odds are they probably have somebody in their life who has a disability. If it's not them, it could be their great Aunt Tilly who's lost her hearing. It could be your father or mother whose hips have gone out and they need some assistance walking. It could be your brother or your cousin coming back from Iraq or Afghanistan missing a limb, or a child born with Down syndrome or autism. So what we find is that people with disabilities are in our sphere, right? People, as my friend Clark Matthews says, people with disabilities were around long before stairs. But if you know that person, if that person's in your life, they're simply your friend or your loved one or your family member. And they don't have the same kind of baggage attached to that label that you might often see in media or more frequently see in media.
Yeah, we need some more positive representation.
It becomes JMO, it becomes Lawrence or LCL. They don't think about it, right? Because what are we taught to do in society? We're taught to minimize or erase it. How many times have either of you maybe been told, oh, you don't seem disabled to me, right? And that's because we're not supposed to identify. We're not supposed to come together and shake things up. Because when disabled people get together, we can cause a ruckus. We can do things like, crawl up the stairs of the United States Capitol and make sure that the Americans with Disabilities Act are passed. So there are a lot of things, either consciously or unconsciously, in the way that keep us from getting together and in part keep us from organizing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just add to that, I think we've also all probably heard, somebody say, oh, your disability doesn't define you. Or again, maybe that elderly family member or that family member who, had their hip go out and they have trouble walking and they say, oh, well, they're not disabled. There's that stigmatization of disability as a word that continues to keep us separated.
I've heard that too. Your disability doesn't define you. Excuse me. Thank you both for that. Beth, I'm going to jump back into employment and unemployment. how does unemployment in fact impact their lives?
Yeah, so, oh my gosh, in many, many different ways. I think first and foremost, we have to address healthcare, right? Because lack of good healthcare really leads to having poorer overall health. It can lead to having a little bit more risky health behaviors, things like smoking and physical inactivity, if you're not constantly going to a doctor and getting these checkups. People with disabilities often have a lot of secondary conditions, right? So things like pain, fatigue, depression sometimes can occur. And so all of these things make it really difficult to have a healthy, long life, right? If you don't have access to that healthcare. Personal story of mine is at one of the companies that I worked with in the past, no longer, my prosthetic care was considered cosmetic. So even though prosthetics are a fundamental part of how I get around and am mobile, my health insurance through my company only covered 80% of prosthetic costs. And, you know, that's just one story in a sea of stories on how lack of healthcare could really impact you in your day-to-day life. So that's a huge one. Also, I would say personal fulfillment and empowerment, right? Because a lot of disabled people can work, they just aren't given the opportunity to. You're unable to create generational wealth, right? Set yourself up for success, establish a family, and set your family up for success. And then there are a lot of disabled people, again, who have to choose not to work because of what we discussed earlier. And more than just choosing not to work, some disabled people are unable to get married due to these benefit constraints. So again, Social Security income and Medicaid are really needs-based, and they focus on your current assets and your income to identify if you need these sorts of benefits. So if you're on Social Security income or Medicaid and you marry a partner who's not on those programs, your partner's income and assets are taken into consideration. And so both of your incomes and assets will be, again, used to determine if you're eligible. So because of this, many people, disabled people, lose their benefits if they get married. So there are people who choose not to get married. They live with their significant other and say that they're roommates. So it's sort of like living this secret double life in order to just get, you know, the life-saving resources that we need.
Yeah, we call that the disability tax, right? There are all
Yep.
these hidden costs to being disabled that aren't discussed or that people don't know about. And you once you know they don't click. People don't think about it. It's kind of hidden away until it affects you, until it's in your life, and then all of a sudden you have to think about, how am I going to get to and from my job or the doctor's appointment, and what will my insurance pay for and what won't they pay for? And all those costs ultimately come back to you, and they aren't factored in usually to the benefits that we get from work.
Right.
Or any of that sort of calculus, and you wouldn't know it until and unless you're faced with paying for those things.
Exactly.
And so there are these hidden costs of being disabled because of the inequitable ways that our society is structured, and the fact that disabled people have so often been sort of out of sight, out of mind, erased, as we said, right? You don't seem disabled to me. And so we don't take into account what those added costs might be, and then we're not prepared for them when they occur.
Exactly. It's a lot of purposely created obstacles and loops that the three of us were talking about earlier when we were preparing for this call. There are all these obstacles that are created as barriers to get the access that we need. And those barriers, you know, they're not only a problem in terms of like your motivation and your spirit and all of these things, but sometimes they're physically impossible to overcome, especially if you're living with a disability. So it's really problematic.
And you hear it is around us everywhere, but it's often in code. So when we talk about it in terms of public policy, things like pre-existing conditions,
Yep.
It's code for disability. What that means is that you've got some sort of condition, whether it's mobility impairment or a sensory disability, your vision or your hearing, or something even like diabetes, that they'll have an impact on the things that you need in your daily life, is not talked about as disability. So people don't think about it as disability. But when we look at something like COVID-19, even questions like who will get treated and who won't, come down to those underlying health conditions, another code for disabilities. So then disabled people get hit with this double whammy. Not only are many of us more likely to catch something like COVID-19, more at risk for it because of those underlying health conditions, but we also run the risk of not getting ourselves treated because there's this underlying assumption that the medical professionals make that one will be less likely to survive treatment. And so somebody who's non-disabled gets the ventilator, and somebody who is disabled and maybe who has used a ventilator for years because of their underlying health condition might even have it taken away from them if some of these laws or some of these practices are put into place. And so it's that sort of double whammy of disability that we often don't talk about until we hit a point of crisis.
Yeah, and it's all that underlying nefarious undercurrent of nobody wants to say it, but there's that feeling that if you're disabled, your life has somehow less value, right?
Which, you know, it should be the other way around, right? Because if it's someone that's vulnerable and at high risk, then we should probably do everything within our power to help them, right? Not the opposite. I'm going to move on to the second bucket of our conversation, which is the historical background. Lawrence, it's funny because you mentioned that people with disabilities have been around longer than stairs. Beth, how have persons with disabilities been treated in the past?
Yeah, so like Lauren said, disabled people have been around forever, but disabled advocacy is comparatively recent history, right? The stigmatization of disability has resulted in both the social and economic marginalization of generations of not just Americans with disabilities, but globally, people with disabilities, right? And really, society left people with disabilities in a severe state of impoverishment for many, many centuries. So for a long time, and even today, people have had these biases that really treat disabilities as defects. So if we're talking about like the 1800s, people with disabilities were considered tragic individuals, as Lawrence was alluding to earlier, right? Unfit and unable to contribute to society, and a lot of times assumed to be abnormal. Many were forced to undergo sterilization, forced to enter institutions and asylums where many disabled people spent their entire lives. So ultimately, this really just served to keep us hidden and invisible from general society for a very long time. And this really continued until about World War I and World War II, when increased pressure from veterans who were returning from war, they really expected the government to provide some kind of rehabilitation and some kind of vocational training. And then there were also some technological advancements in the 30s that gave visibility and tools to disabled populations. So at this point in history, people with disabilities still didn't have access to a lot of things, right? Public transportation, telephones, bathrooms, stores, office buildings, work sites, all of these different things. And that didn't really change until the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And this was the first time there was written legislation that provided equal opportunity for employment within the federal government and federally funded programs that prohibited discrimination based on physical or mental disability. So again, that wasn't until 1973, which is very wild to think about. And specifically Section 504 of this act also made equal access a mandate in terms of public services and public transportation. Another landmark piece of legislation was in 1975, which is named the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This was, of course, passed to guarantee equal access to public education for children with disabilities. And it specified that really every child had the right to education and mandated full inclusion of children with disabilities in mainstream education classes. And I know that Lawrence will talk a little bit more about the ADA, but that happened in 1990. So really, when you're talking about all-encompassing legislature, we're talking recent history, the past few decades.
That's not that long ago.
No, it's not that long ago. And one of the things that people need to keep in mind about the ADA, because there's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding about it, And thank you for
Lawrence,
that.
can you explain what the ADA is for those that don't know?
Sure. So it's short for the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. And just under a decade after that, they did the Americans with Disabilities Amendments Act to kind of clarify some of the misconceptions around the ADA, because it was being interpreted, the law was being interpreted differently by different courts, and it needed some legal clarification in order to be enacted or be utilized in the way that it was intended. One thing that's really necessary and important to bring up about the ADA is it is a civil rights law. That's a law that says you cannot be discriminated against because of your disability, period. And it's broad reaching, but it's not done. You know, Beth talked a little earlier about the different models or the different ways we've framed disability throughout history. The dominant one by far to this day is the medical model of disability. The medical model of disability says disability is something to be gotten rid of. It's something to be cured, cut out, fixed, in other words. And that if somebody is experiencing discrimination or can't get in the building, it's their own fault as a result of that disability. There's something else, kind of a competing model of disability that's called the social model of disability. That social model of disability puts that, takes that burden, if you will, away from the individual, doesn't blame the individual and says, hey, it's not my fault if you didn't think about people who use wheelchairs when you built this building. It's not my fault that you put stairs instead of a ramp, and you didn't put the elevator in there, and you didn't think about Braille, or you didn't include deaf people when you made this movie, and you didn't think about captions. So it really puts that back in the laps of society to say it's up to all of us to make this world accessible for all of us. And then there are other models that are sort of emerging as society changes, like the cultural model of disability, where people are embracing the fact that if you have a disability or you become disabled later in life, which is what happens to 80% of those who have disabilities, you become part of a group. You become part of a family or a tribe, that there's strength in coming together, as we've talked about, raising a ruckus, right? I didn't get involved with disability community until I was 35 years old, even though I was drafted to be a poster child when I was 5. There was 30 years of learning that I could have had there that I didn't take advantage of, because when I grew up in the 70s, we were encouraged to be as normal as humanly possible, whatever the heck that means. And it wasn't until I realized I was never going to be normal that I was able to embrace, disability or not, that I was able to embrace disability community and learn all those things that I should have learned much earlier. Which is a long-winded way of saying that people need to know that, unlike meat inspectors, let's say, who at the US Department of Agriculture, who go out and inspect plants, meat processing plants, the ADA, how that's enforced is it requires people who have been aggrieved to file a complaint with the Justice Department. So you have to do the homework yourself. You have to take the initiative. You have to file the claim with the DOJ. It can take several months, up to a year, for the DOJ to get back to you. We know within certain administrations, they may not be getting back to you at all. And you know, you've got to figure out, is the establishment going to get up to code? What action is going to take place? If you don't file that claim, they're never going to look into that episode of discrimination. So, you know, most of the times the DOJ will work with the establishment to correct those violations. But if the individual doesn't do that themselves, it'll never go forward. So that's just an important thing that people need to know.
That is so confusing and much work, right? Because if you don't even know if you've been discriminated against, right? Like, who's going to tell you? Right. And you know, if you have, then you have to take it upon yourself, you know, to figure out how have they discriminated against you, right? And then take it up, you know, with the government. So I have a question about that, Lawrence. And who represents you? Like, do you then have to find your own representation when you?
Yes, you do. I mean, they have people at the DOJ that will look into it. but a determination will be made based on whether or not the establishment corrects those problems or those violations. Let's be clear, they're violations of the law. The law has been around for 30 years. If I waited 30 years to do the job that my boss gave to me, I wouldn't have a job for very long, right? Just as a business takes into account, they need to get somebody in there that knows, an electrician to do the wiring for the lights, and that needs to fix the plumbing for the restroom. You should just think about disability and access in the same way. Is this my place of business ADA compliant, so that it doesn't come back and bite you on the backside at some point later? Disability has to be baked in from the beginning, not an afterthought, not something that you change when somebody like Beth or myself decides we're going to sue you for a violation. So it really, first they do, a process where they look at the violation, they try to come to some sort of understanding, make sure that's corrected. If that's not corrected, then the person has to sue the establishment and find representation on their own.
How often are they corrected?
That's a good question. I don't, a lot of them are, so they do settlements, which means the case never goes to court. And without the numbers, I don't know that anybody tracks exactly. I worked in government at the National Council on Disability, which is the federal agency the ADA came out of, as their media guy from 2011 until 2016. And I don't recall seeing any number crunchers who were counting those exact numbers. So that's something that would be good to know, but I don't know that anybody is tracking numbers in those ways. Not that I've ever seen.
Right, another barrier.
Yeah.
And I would just add too that, while the ADA, and I would say, I was born in 1988, so the ADA was passed in 1990. So perhaps you could consider me the first generation that really grew up with the ADA in effect. And while it's great in a lot of ways, it is limited, right? Because, anecdotally, I can sit and talk this whole webinar about all the physical barriers that still exist, and how even though, the ADA has mandates for how new construction should be built. I live in New York City, which is one of the most accessible cities in America, according to those guidelines, right? But I can tell you that the majority of places here, and anybody who's calling in from like New York knows that it is really not accessible day to day, right? And a lot of the ADA's regulations don't apply because a lot of these buildings and establishments were built before 1990. Right, so it's very limited in that way as well.
Yeah, so it gets grandfathered in as sort of this building was around. It's a historical building. It would be too cost prohibitive, whatever. And so the way that the ADA works is it's those things have been built, created post ADA, and then if it's funded by the government, right? So if it's your city hall, for example, or your town hall where the city legislature gets together, or the state legislature gets together in the governor's office, then those things have to be accessible because they're paid for by our tax dollars. But it gets more and more difficult, sort of the more granular we get and the more local we get in terms of people understanding the law and then being able to apply it without all the help.
And then my final note would just say that there's a difference between being compliant and being accessible, right? So we've all seen buildings, as an example, a physical building that maybe has a physical ramp, but just because the ramp is compliant doesn't mean that it makes sense, or it's a convenient way of accessing the building, or it's not, in the back of the building down 50 different hallways through like a strange access door that's really not safe for you to like navigate. So yeah, I think that's another misunderstanding too, is just because you're compliant with the law, it doesn't mean that it's truly accessible.
Yeah,
it's like an afterthought, right?
Is a floor, not a ceiling, right? Compliance is the least amount that you can do so that you don't get sued. But as we know, with any element of design or creativity, that doesn't mean it's the best that you can do. We keep gaining more information all the time, better information all the time. We've got 30 years of lived experience since the law was passed, and the other laws that Beth mentioned that were passed before that even. So it's, it's really important that we apply those lessons that we learn in real life to try to make things as inclusive and accessible as possible, and not just do the minimum that's required by law. That's just good customer service, right? Do you want your customers to be happy? Do you want your patrons to be happy? Then you need to create a seamless environment where they're not even thinking twice about access. They're able to enjoy whatever that is, shopping or the performance, whatever it could be, alongside their peers without missing a beat.
Yes, I love that, and thank you both for all that information on previous legislature, also for talking about the ADA, and the history of how people with disabilities have been treated. But Lawrence, I want to go back to you because we talked about the media perception, right?
Yes.
How far does it go? Like, can you share some historical background, and has that changed at all throughout the years?
It's changed, but it hasn't changed significantly, right? So disabled people, as we sort of talked about earlier, have been marginalized since media began, before media began, probably on the cave paintings, right? Probably, I'd say the most staggering and sobering realization is that more often than not, disabled people aren't even badly represented because it doesn't get that far. More often than not, disabled people are absent. We're not even part of that larger tapestry or fabric. We're not seen, our issues are not discussed, and we're barely even acknowledged or considered. So think about it this way, right? If disabled people in the US are at least 26% of the population, then that means when we look at any type of news story or any type of narrative film that's done, disabled people should be 25% of everything, everyone doing every kind of thing that you can imagine. So that there could be deaf teachers, blind preachers, wheelchair using bus drivers, drug dealers with service animals, assassins with intellectual disabilities, paragliding lawyers with mental health issues, right? You name it, all over film and TV, all over the news. Disabled people should be there. Clearly, we are not. And we should be there in all our diversity, and all our all the different facets that we bring to our life. Portrayals historically, when they have occurred without a lot of depth or nuance, where disabled people are there to serve as warnings or lessons to non-disabled people and to their stories. Disabled people are seldom the focus of the story or the protagonist. More often than not, we're kind of props in somebody else's story that's being told from the point of view of our non-disabled peers. Back in 2012, I did a project with Inclusion in the Arts there in New York City, where we pitched and then ended up curating. I curated and then co-hosted on Turner Classic Movies a history of disability in film. And I looked at 237 movies to decide 20 that we could show over the course of an entire month. We would show 4 or 5 of them in one night. And it was everything from the silent era up through 1990 when the ADA was passed, because we had to put a time limit on there somewhere. And there were a lot of things, the things that really rose up through the course of that research and watching all those films where I was kind of like Malcolm McDowell at the end of Clockwork Orange. The media tends to this day, still use the medical model of disability. It's something to be fixed, cured, gotten rid of. Disabled people are underrepresented, both in terms of employment in the media, right? As we talked about earlier, we're not the producers, we're not the editors, we're not the reporters, and in the portrayals in the media, right? Do you see the blind bus driver? Well, you wouldn't want to see that. Maybe the blind teacher or the deaf bus driver. The focus is always on the condition more than the individual. And disability community, more than one disabled person, or let's say a disabled person of color, or maybe a disabled person who is also a member of the LGBTQ community, maybe a disabled person who's an immigrant, forget about it. You might as well search for a unicorn. Within the media landscape, disability is complicated enough that they don't think to realize that there are disabled people in all those other areas of life as well. So the other thing I would say is a lot of employment schemes within media will look at diversity and inclusion, but disability is never part of that matrix. And I always like to say that disability puts the D in diversity. It's right there at the front of the word, right? It starts with the D, not as an afterthought. And then the last thing I think it's really important to say is that conventional media, mainstream media, does not recognize disability art, does not recognize disability media, does not recognize disability history or disability culture. So as we talked about how disability has been perceived as a deficit throughout time, post 1990, when the ADA was passed, now because of the internet, because of people coming together in community, if you ask, 10 different disabled folks what the word disability means to them, they're going to come back to you. Probably very few of them are going to say something about their medical condition or their impairment. What they're going to tell you is things like history, culture. If they're in politics, they're going to talk about constituency. More often than not, they're going to talk about community, what it's like to get to know other disabled people and to hang out with them and to learn from them. And so as we think about the definitions of disability, you're going to be at a disadvantage and you're going to kind of show yourself to be living in the past if all you're thinking of is the medical model, because society increasingly has moved on from that and is including other definitions of disability as well.
Thank you, Lawrence. I can't help but think as I'm, hearing you speak, is we have a long way to go. Yeah. I mean, yes, strides have been made along the way and the last few decades, because it hasn't been that long. But we really do have a long way to go. And we're about to go into like my favorite part of the conversation is, what can we do to affect change? We have a few minutes left before we go into Q&A, and I saw some of the questions. We have a lot of questions. So I'm going to ask you first, Beth, what can we do to affect change? What are some actionable steps that we can take?
Yeah, so I mean, we've talked a lot about representation, but I just want to quickly mention it again because it is so important. We're really not exposed to the stories of disabled people. We're not hearing about their experiences, their work, their challenges, or their culture in mainstream media. So we really do need that representation. I also think it's super important for everybody who either identifies as having a disability or doesn't, to diversify your social feeds and engage with disabled creators. So if you're someone on Instagram or YouTube or Facebook and you're not following any disability pages or disabled people, disabled influencers, disabled business owners, that's definitely something that you should seek out. And again, I am one disabled person out of millions of disabled people, and I represent a very specific experience. So when we talk about diversifying your social feeds, we're not talking about following one or two people. We're talking about following a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds, right? And then the third thing is to really educate yourself. So read books by disabled authors, Google disabled advocacy. This talk should really not be the end all be all or the only education that you receive about this topic. So one great book that I absolutely recommend is called Disability Visibility by Alice Wong. It's a collection of stories from many different disabled folks, each about their own experiences.
Thank you, Beth. LCL, I'm coming to you.
Yeah, I would say one of the best, a couple of the best things people can do. One is whether you like or dislike what you see out there in the culture and in the media, the usual gatekeepers are gone now. There used to be this sort of buffer between us and the news media. Now you can go right to Twitter. You can go right to Instagram and have a direct conversation with that person or call them out directly. So I would say whether you like what you see or whether you don't, and it's just as important either way. I think our culture is more apt to give somebody grief if we don't like something. But if you want to see somebody do more of a story you like, encourage them. Tell them you like that story. That's just as important as calling out something you don't like. I would say both are important, necessary even. And the other thing I would say is, disability is not a 4-letter word. Disability has 10 letters, right? And so we shouldn't treat it like a slur. And if the definitions have been changing and that they continue to change, probably the best thing that anybody who has a disability can do to help out disability community, to help out your peers, and disability culture writ large, is to identify. And to identify means that you own it loud and proud, that you don't let anybody take it away from you. You don't let anybody erase it. You don't let anybody minimize it, right? We're not doing that finally in our culture with regard to race and ethnicity, with regard to gender identity. People are pleased and they're saying, this is my experience. This is where I come from. I want to own that. Don't erase that. This is important. It's part of who I am. The same is true with disability. So what I would encourage you to do, whether you've had a disability all your life and these things are just kind of dawning on you, or you're recently disabled due to incident or accident, or lucky enough to live long enough, would be to seek out other disabled people. Find other disabled people, learn from them. Grow with them, be in solidarity with them, and ask yourself, where are the gaps in my own understanding and knowledge, and then seek answers to those questions.
Thank you, Lawrence. Beth, last question for you. What do you wish your colleagues or friends or family knew in the way that they treat you?
Yeah, so I would say, to not just them, but everybody on this call, that you may not personally identify with having a disability right now, right? But the truth is, at some point, you or someone you know will have a disability. They will. Disability is a part of life. 1/3 of all people are either born with a disability or they develop one, whether it's through an accident, through trauma, or the simple process of aging, right? So it's possible that you yourself, listening to this call, if you don't already identify with being disabled, it's possible that you will become disabled someday. And if knowing that fact gives you some kind of negative response, really explore that feeling, because that feeling is the root of ableism. So my life as a disabled person, and the lives of other people who identify with being disabled, we don't have less value. And if you feel some type of, again, some type of way, some type of negative response to the idea that you may someday identify with having a disability, that's what we need to explore, not just as individuals, but really as a society and a culture.
Thank you, Beth. That's definitely so powerful. And I think that's something that people that are listening should definitely take away, that, if you don't know someone right now, if you're not affected by it at some point in your life, you're going to be. And oftentimes we don't pay attention, we don't care about things that are going on because we're not affected by it, right? But it's a very different story if we are. So thank you for that. Lawrence, last question for you before we dive into the Q&A. What advice would you give to others on how they can change the perception and the narrative that they've been introduced to from the media? I know that Beth talked about this a lot, representation.
Yeah, I would say pay attention in what you see, what you hear, what you read. Make a conscious attempt to kind of be your own critic in terms of how disability is represented in media. And as I said earlier, if you see something you like, let the people who created it know that. If you see things you don't like, let the people who created it know that. It's really important, I think, more than anything else at this stage in our development, as disability continues to evolve in the minds and in the consciousness of people, that we speak up, that we stand up, metaphorically speaking, if need be, that we're loud and that we're proud and that we're not ashamed and we don't shy away. The only way these stereotypes are going to change, the only way that we're going to see more and more increased representation, things like Ali Stoker in a made-for-TV movie on Lifetime, which is huge in terms of sort of culture change. The only way we're going to see more of those types of films with maybe people of color with disabilities, or immigrants with disabilities, or LGBTQ folks with disabilities, is if we tell the people that made those movies and the networks in which they appear, thank you for doing that. That was the way to do it. Or where were you coming from? Why are you stuck in 1965? This is how you need to change it. It's really important, I think, more than anything at this point, sort of going back to the title of the book, is disability visibility. And that's more than being seen. It also means being heard and being part of the larger community or communities of folks with disabilities as well. No one is an island. There are others out here. And so it's to everyone's benefit if you get connected.
Thank you. Thank you both for everything that you shared and for being so honest and so transparent as well. I'm going to jump into the Q&A. Like I said, we have quite a bit of questions. So I'm going to start with Chris. This one's for you, Beth. Chris asked, I love and agree that simply being visible and existing is a form of resistance and political affirmation. How about those of us with invisible disabilities? I personally feel existing and still being visible can be a societal form of resistance. Thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that, you know, the experience of somebody who is living with an invisible disability in a lot of ways is challenging in a different way than someone like myself who is existing with a visible disability, right? Because I know people who have, you know, chronic illnesses, who really struggle with mental health, who again have anxiety or things that they really need accommodations for, and they struggle with being seen and respected even within the disabled community, in addition to outside the disabled community. So yes, like Lawrence touched on earlier, I think living loud and proud and really, you know, I like the word disability. It's how I identify. It's a core part of who I am. There are a lot of things that my disability has had me learn over the years, right? How to advocate for myself, how to be a direct communicator, how to plan every scenario from A to Z in like 1,000 different ways. Those are things that are really intrinsic to my personality that are the result of being disabled. So when we talk about living loud and proud, you might have an invisible disability, but you're just as worthy and just as valuable and educated on living with a disability as somebody with a visible disability. It's a different experience, right? And I think that we need to change the perception of what disability is in a lot of ways for people who don't identify with having a disability, because people tend to lump everyone with a disability under one bucket, right? They think that it can be seen. They think that, you know, a lot of the things that Lawrence talked about, that were tragic cases that deserve to be pitied or were inspirational simply for existing. And by identifying with this word disability and really showing the diverse group of people that we are, like, that is a political act. It is an act of rebellion. And living loudly and proudly and identifying as somebody who either has this visible or invisible disability is a way of advocating for yourself and the community as a whole.
Thank you, Beth. Speaking of perception, I'm going to go right into the next question. Anonymous asked, how do people with disabilities respond to society about not working while people assume they are lazy?
I would say it's perfectly fine not to work. What's bad is the assumption, right? What's bad is that notion that by having a disability, by not working, one is lazy. I just got to say, you know, we've got to rethink what we value in our society. Everyone has value, whether they work or not. We've got to divorce the individual. We've got to divorce the communities from the assumptions about them. And we've got to look to the deeper questions. What's more important than the almighty dollar? What's more important than productivity? I think hopefully our own experiences of COVID-19 have given us an opportunity to examine those questions, to ask ourselves those questions. How our, not only our individual lives, but how our cultures, how our communities, how our workplaces can be different, and how we can value what every person brings to the table, whether they're working or not. People have experiences that they live. They have insights that they've gained as a result of those experiences that can inform the decisions that we make to make everybody a part of the planning process. I would just simply say, if you're part of a city council or a school board or any sort of organizing body, ask yourself, what are the disability components? Where are our disability components within the work that we're already doing? If you can't identify them, then start reaching out to disability groups, to the Independent Living Center. There are over 400 of them across the nation, which help people with disabilities live lives outside of institutions on their own terms. Be proactive in seeking the gaps in your own knowledge and then in filling those gaps. And I would just simply say, people are going to have the assumptions that they're going to have about us, and people who don't want to look at disability, who don't want to evolve with the times, are going to continue making those assumptions in the same way they might about gender or sexual orientation or any other thing. You don't have to pick that up and carry it around with you. Life is too short for other people's stigma, for other people's shame. For everybody out there that has a bigoted view or a misunderstanding, there are tens of hundreds, if not thousands, who know differently. Seek those people out instead.
Thank you, LCL. I know that we're at time, but I have one more question that I want to ask, and then we can sign off. So if you folks can stick around for a couple more minutes, that would be great. The last question that I have is from Stoic Dan. He asked, what are some motivational resources for people with disabilities? My philosophy discussion groups help people learn stoicism. I think I said that right. To help people overcome disabilities of all kinds. Before and during COVID, we've been inclusive to people with disabilities, wheelchair and stroke.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the most inspirational sources are seeing other members of my own community. So as somebody who's constantly on Instagram, probably to the point of a fault, I have loved following all of the disabled influencers that I've seen, because everyone's approach to life is different. And it's amazing seeing, again, the diversity that exists within disability. And even though we're all so different and our experiences are so different, we're such a supportive network of people. I'll also say that, this is maybe a personal thing, and I'm not saying this at all as an attack on verbiage, but I have never wanted to think of, my disability as something to be overcome. My disability is something that has profoundly dictated who I am as a person. I'm proud of it. I think it's made me a much stronger individual. It's made me way more empathetic. It's made me, an advocate for other people in addition to just the disabled community. So I never want to be in a place where I'm looking for sources that will help me sort of overcome the idea of being disabled. I want to look for sources that help me rejoice in being disabled. So that would be my main advice to anybody who's listening, is to look for sources that make you feel joy in being part of this amazing community.
Thank you, Beth. LCL, before I jump onto you, Beth, one last thing. You mentioned some influencers on Instagram and social media. After this event, if you can just share some of those names with me so that we can share with folks on the blog, that would be great, because I don't know where to find any of these people. So that would be great if we can share some of that information.
Absolutely.
Lawrence,
Yes.
to you. I'm the same question that I asked Beth is for you now. What are some motivational resources for people with disabilities?
Embrace what I don't know. I really think, when some sort of switch flipped at some point in my life where I got really curious about where I was ignorant. And the one thing I would like to cure in this world is ignorance. And it's imminently curable. It's absolutely curable. There's always more to learn. There's always more to understand. There's always more to comprehend. And I would say embrace that process. For me, I was born with cerebral palsy. That meant specifically that I walk a little funny. I walk differently than most people. But through the course of my lifetime, as I've aged, I've had severe bouts of depression, some of which have lasted for years. I've had chronic lung problems as a result of the forest fires and some of the things here in California. So, while one of my disabilities is pretty easy to spot when I walk in the room, the others aren't as easy to spot. Where I've perhaps learned the most is sort of leaning into those areas that aren't quite as obvious, as Beth was talking about earlier. If I know what mobility disability is about and I have a good experience of that, I would just encourage people to get curious about what it's like to be deaf, capital D deaf, and to identify as deaf. What the experience of people who have vision impairments or who are blind might be. You have yourself some friends, get to know some folks with intellectual disabilities. or with psychiatric disabilities or learning disabilities, ADHD or dyslexia. All of those things are going to inform your opinions, are going to expand your understanding, and make you a better advocate for your community. I don't even talk about being a person with a disability anymore. I talk about being a disabled person or a part of disability community, because there's more than one of us out there. There's a whole communities of us out there, and I want people to talk about and to embrace and get to learn the benefits that I've learned from being a part of those communities that have only, as Beth was sort of saying, enriched and made my life better. So I would simply say, find what jazzes you in this conversation, what stokes you, what you get pumped about, what surprised you, what you didn't expect, and then lean into that as much as you can, and make a conscious decision to explore it and see where it'll take you.
Thank you, LCL. You know, as you were talking about being born with cerebral palsy, there was something that I thought of, and I'm just going to say it because it was like a really great joke. I know that I've been giving you like a hard time about your hair, but I'm like, something else that you've been born with was like great hair.
I'm going to put that on the resume. Well, thank you.
Yeah, you're born with great hair. Anyway, I know that we're out of time and we're over. Thank you both so much for all the information, all the insight, for your experiences, for everything that you shared. I hope that everyone got as much out of this as I did. This was a great experience and a great opportunity to learn more about persons with disabilities. And for those that had to leave early or dialed in late, you can find a recap and a recording of this event on our blog, meetup.com/blog. And again, thank you both so much for today. And thank you for everyone that tuned in and for staying on a little longer with us.
Yeah,
thank you for having me.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Jeanine, and to Meetup Live for hosting this conversation. I feel like we just barely got warmed up.
Yeah,
I feel the same way. I'm like, wait, can we just keep on going? So, you know, we're just going to leave it as this was part 1. There will be part 2.
perfect.
Thank you both, and thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.